Hey everyone, welcome back to Bear It In Mind. This video is going to summarise the whole of the forensics topic. This is designed to give you an overview, so if you want more in-depth explanations of any part of forensics, you can find a full playlist of videos on each section on the Bear It In Mind YouTube channel. If you want more help with your revision to study smarter and save you time, you can join Bear It In Mind, where you'll find a variety of resources from interactive quizzes, exam paper walkthrough videos, exemplar answers and much more. Link is in the description. Let's start with offender profiling. Offender profiling is an investigative technique that produces a description of the characteristics of an offender based on the crime scene and other data to help narrow down the list of suspects. There are two primary approaches to offender profiling that you need to know. The top-down approach, developed in the United States by the FBI, and the bottom-up approach, developed in the United Kingdom by psychologist David Cantor. It's called the top-down approach because they start with a template before they analyse the crime. In other words, they have a pre-existing category or typology through which they see the crime scene. The FBI profiler Roy Hazelwood was credited with classifying serial homicide crime scenes into organised and disorganised types. This typology of organised and disorganised was then studied further by FBI agents John Douglas and Robert Resler, who in the 1980s conducted prison interviews with convicted serial sexual murderers, which included the likes of Ted Bundy. In total, they interviewed 36 convicted sexual murderers. Here is a list of some of the crime scene behaviours of an organised offender. And here is a list of the personality characteristics. And here is a list of some of the crime scene behaviours of a disorganised offender, and here is a list of their personality characteristics. The top-down approach has been criticised for lacking empirical support. In a 2004 study, psychologist David Cantor analysed 100 cases of serial murder and found no clear distinction between organised and disorganised offenders. This suggests the typology lacks scientific validity and may oversimplify complex criminal behaviours. The top-down approach has been further criticised in terms of its original sample. This is because it's based on interviews conducted by FBI agents with 36 serial sex murderers, which is a rather limited sample, which makes it harder to generalise. In contrast to the top-down approach with its fixed typologies of organised and disorganised, the bottom-up approach doesn't start with that assumption, but rather starts with the details of the crime and works up to build an understanding of the offender from there. This involves what David Cantor called investigative psychology. This is where a data-driven approach is needed. What you need, according to Cantor, is a statistical database that records details about crimes. This then enables them to identify patterns that occur across crime scenes. When a crime is committed, it can be compared with this database for any similarities, which can then be used to make predictions about the characteristics of an offender. Furthermore, investigative psychology assumes something called interpersonal coherence. This is the idea that the way the offender behaved at the crime scene will be consistent with how they behave in everyday life. The bottom-up approach also involves geographical profiling. This is the study of spatial behaviour in relation to crime and offenders. This includes the notion that offenders could be marauders, where they have a home-based location that they commit crimes out from, or commuters, where they have travelled a distance away from their home base. A well-known application of the bottom-up approach is the case of John Duffy, known as the railway rapist. After committing multiple sexual assaults and murders in London, he remained unidentified for some time. David Cantor was consulted and used both investigative and geographical profiling. His profile accurately predicted Duffy's home location, relationship status, job, social traits, and physical characteristics, demonstrating the practical value of the bottom-up approach in criminal investigations. At this point, we can compare the top-down and bottom-up approaches to offender profiling. Firstly, the FBI's top-down typology approach is based on the arguably unreliable interview data of the murderers they interviewed, as well as the intuition of the profiler. In contrast, the bottom-up approach is based on psychological theory, as seen in mental mapping and schemas, as well well as statistical analysis of crime scene data. This allows it to be more objective and scientific in its attempt to create an offender profile. Secondly, the top-down approach is based on a limited sample of 36 serial sexual murderers, which, as we mentioned earlier, is a rather limited sample to generalise to, resulting in it only being applicable to sex-related murderers and not other types of criminals. In contrast, the bottom-up approach, with its investigative psychology and geographical profiling, is not limited to one particular type of crime, and therefore it could be argued is more effective in aiding the police in identifying offenders. However, caution is necessary, as profiling can still lead to wrongful accusations. The case of Rachel Nickel is a notable example, where psychologist Paul Britton's profile led police to wrongly target Colin Stagg, who was later cleared. The real killer, Robert Napper, was only identified years later, highlighting the danger of over-reliance on offender profiling. In his 1876 book called Criminal Man, Lombroso suggested that criminals were a more primitive version of humans. He formulated his ideas at the time when Charles Darwin had recently introduced the theory of evolution. And based on this theory, Lombroso suggested that criminals are essentially evolutionary throwbacks to an earlier species who were inferior to non-criminals. Atavistic means a tendency to revert to an ancestral type. Atavus is the Latin for ancestor. And for Lombroso, these criminal types could be identified by certain distinctive physical features. The explanation, the reason why they commit crimes, according to Lombroso, is because they are genetic throwbacks. They are less evolved, and therefore the behaviour of these biological throwbacks will inevitably not fit in with the rules and expectations of modern civilized society. Lombroso supported his theory through post-mortem and anatomical examinations of thousands of Italian convicts, concluding that 40% of criminal acts were committed by those with atavistic features. There are many problems with Lombroso's research. Firstly, it was correlational. This means that his research investigated a relationship between physical defects in the face and the skull and criminal behaviour. However, there is a lack of control of variables in such research, which means that it cannot be said that this research demonstrates that atavistic form is the cause of criminal behaviour. For example, some have argued that the physical defects could have been the result of poor nutrition in childhood, and criminal behaviour such as theft could be explained in terms of environmental factors such as poverty. Secondly, there was no control group in his research. Lombroso found these physical defects in the group of offenders, but he did not have a group to compare them with, a group of normal, non-criminal people. It could be that the physical defects he identified were actually not that abnormal from the average population. In fact, Goring in 1913 carried out a study that compared over 3,000 London criminals with a non-criminal control group and did not find evidence of an atavistic form in the criminal group. In other words, there was no difference between the two groups in relation to Lombroso's theory. Despite these criticisms, Lombroso has been praised by some as the father of modern criminology. This is because he was the first person to make crime and criminals a specific area of study, which has led to much improved theories of offending that we have today. Some have also suggested that in trying to describe how particular types of people are likely to commit particular crimes, it was the beginning of offender profiling. He was the first to tell the police that criminals had a distinctive set of characteristics that could help narrow down the list of suspects. However, one of the major ways Lombroso's theory has been criticised is for being biologically deterministic. This is because his theory states that the cause of criminal behaviour is because of an uncontrollable inborn biological factor. A person is a genetic throwback, a less evolved person. This implies that a person has no choice over their behaviour, which flies in the face of the free will argument. It can lead people to blame their biology for their behaviour. In this case, if someone committed a crime, they could argue that it's not their fault. It's not their responsibility because they can't do anything about their biology. But if someone stood up in court and used that as their defence, the judge would still say, you are responsible for your actions and so you will bear the consequences. In other words, a purely deterministic view is at odds with the justice system and society's understanding of responsibility. Finally, Lombroso's atavistic theory has been criticised for its scientific racism. This is because, as we saw earlier, part of Lombroso's description of the criminal form included things like dark skin, and some have argued that some of Lombroso's descriptions of the criminal type had racial prejudice. This led to the negative stereotyping of certain groups of people based on their appearance, leading to discrimination. The DNA a person inherits from their parents may give them a predisposition to criminal behaviour. Enter the MAOA gene, dubbed the warrior gene for its link to aggression. The MAOA gene produces monoamine oxidase A. This is an enzyme that breaks down neurotransmitters, specifically serotonin, dopamine, and noradrenaline. Too much or too little of a neurotransmitter can affect our behaviour, and not always for the better. So meet Jim. Jim has something different going on with the MAOA gene. His MAOA gene has low activity. It's known as MAOA L. As a result, this means there is less MAOA in Jim's body, and that means there is less MAOA to break down those neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, and noradrenaline, which means there are more of these neurotransmitters in Jim's brain, which has been linked to increased aggression. In 1993, Brunner et al. Studied a rather unusual Dutch family. It became apparent that many of the males in this family, across several generations, and who lived in different parts of the country, had repeatedly committed acts of violent criminal behaviour. When these family members were studied, it was found that each of these violent family members had low MAOA activity, whereas the males in the family who had not committed any violent criminal behaviours did not carry this mutated gene. One study conducted research with mice with MAOA knockouts and found that they were highly aggressive compared to mice without the MAOA knockout. Further human evidence comes from a provocation study using hot sauce as a measure of aggression. Individuals with MAOA-L were more aggressive in high provocation conditions, but not in low provocation ones. In other words, individuals with low MAOA activity will be more likely to react with aggression in response to provocation. Caspi et al. In 2002 conducted a longitudinal study of over 1,000 boys and found that those with the MAOA-L gene who were also maltreated in childhood were significantly more likely to develop antisocial behaviour. This supports the diathesis stress model, which proposes that genetic vulnerability interacts with environmental stress to produce behaviour. Now we come to the neural explanation, which focuses on the nervous system and, for the purposes of this video, specifically the brain and one part of the brain known as the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is thought to be responsible for decision making, impulse control, and regulating our emotions. In other words, if you had a less developed prefrontal cortex, you would find it harder to control your emotions, such as anger and rage. And you would have less self-control. You'd be more impulsive.
What do you mean everyone?
And these are the key characteristics of someone likely to be violent. In 1997, Adrian Raine conducted a study on murderers who during their trial pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. The murderers' brains showed a significant reduction in the activity of the prefrontal cortex compared with the control group. These results were very important because it potentially identified parts of the brain that may be behind criminal behaviour. In another study, Raine et al. In 2000 found an 11% reduction in the size of the prefrontal cortex in people with antisocial personality disorder. The researchers suggested that this impairment specifically characterizes impulsively violent offenders, suggesting that the prefrontal cortex acts as an emergency brake on runaway emotions. However, Raine himself has pointed out a few limitations of this research. First, the findings from the research are correlational. They only show an association between the reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex and criminal behaviour. They don't show causality. They don't show that the reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex is the cause of criminal behaviour. It could be the other way around. The change in the structure of the brain and its activity could be the result of criminal behaviour. Or, because it's correlational, it could be that the abnormalities in the brains of criminals are signs of another variable, such as early abuse. Secondly, the genetic and neural explanation have been criticised for being deterministic. This is because the theory states that the cause of criminal behaviour is because of uncontrollable inborn biological factors. One of the problems with arguing that biology is the cause is that it can lead people to blame their biology for their behaviour. In other words, a purely deterministic view is at odds with the justice system and society's understanding of responsibility. Thirdly and finally, one way these explanations have been criticised is because if they are taken on their own, if it's just genetics and brain structure, then this can be very socially sensitive. Psychological research can be used for human good, but that same research can potentially be applied in ways that can cause harm. How does this apply to biological explanations of crime? Imagine you are someone who hasn't committed a crime, but you have been identified as having brain abnormalities with your prefrontal cortex. Could this mean that whether you commit a criminal behaviour is now inevitable? And if there is a criminal gene, should these people be identified before they've even committed a crime? Imagine being labelled as a potential criminal before you even act. During World War II, Hans Eysenck worked as a psychologist in military hospitals in England, and from his observations of the different soldiers he treated, he suggested two core dimensions of personality. He called these extroversion versus introversion and neuroticism versus stability. Later on in his research, Eysenck added a third dimension, which he called psychoticism, combining together into his three-factor model, sometimes referred to as PEN. Extroversion refers to people who are more outgoing, enjoy social interactions, prefer the company of others, and seek excitement and stimulation. According to Eysenck, extroversion and introversion are affected by the level of cortical arousal. The RAS in the brainstem is thought to act as a filter that controls how much stimulation or activation the brain receives. So now meet Eric. Eric is an extrovert. Eysenck's theory suggested that the RAS in extroverts filters out more information than normal, which means they are less stimulated. In other words, they have a lower level of cortical arousal. As a result, people like Eric may be drawn to criminal acts that offer an adrenaline rush or a sense of danger. Eysenck's model explains how arousal levels influence the ability to learn from social conditioning. Conditioning, in this context, refers to how we learn what is good behaviour and what is bad behaviour. Well, Eysenck suggests that extroverts like Eric are less easily conditioned because of their lower arousal. They do not learn as easily from punishments or rewards because their under-aroused nervous system makes them less responsive to external feedback. Neuroticism, according to Eysenck, refers to an individual's emotional instability. People high in neuroticism are more likely to react strongly to stress. So meet Neil. Neil is high in neuroticism, which means he's more prone to anxiety, fear, anger, and emotional reactivity. In a criminal context, Neil may act out aggressively when faced with stressful situations. This emotional reactivity is thought to be connected to an overactive limbic system in the brain. It involves areas such as the amygdala and hypothalamus, which regulate emotional responses like fear and aggression. Psychoticism is the tendency to be antisocial, cold, and less empathetic. According to Eysenck, people like Phil who score high in this trait are the ones most likely to engage in serious criminal behaviour. Why? Because they simply don't care about social norms or how their actions affect others. For Eysenck, the criminal personality is high in all three dimensions. Supporting evidence for the criminal personality comes from Eysenck and Eysenck in 1977, who conducted a study using the Eysenck Personality Questionnaire to compare the personalities of offenders and non-offenders. They found that offenders scored significantly higher on psychoticism, extroversion, and neuroticism, supporting the idea of a distinct criminal personality type. However, Eysenck's criminal personality has been criticised in a number of ways. Research by Bartel and Holenchok found that a group of Hispanic American inmates in a New York prison scored lower on extroversion than predicted by Eysenck's theory. This suggests the model may not generalise across cultures and that personality and its links to crime may differ depending on cultural background. Secondly, determinism. This is because one of the main factors behind the criminal personality is biology. And one of the problems with arguing that biology is the cause is that it can lead people to blame their biology for their behaviour. In other words, a purely deterministic view is at odds with the justice system and society's understanding of responsibility and free will. In simple terms, Sutherland proposed that people learn the attitudes, techniques, and motivations for criminal behaviour through association and interaction with different people. First, behaviourism and social learning theory. When a behaviour is reinforced, it makes it more likely that it will be repeated. For example, criminal behaviour can be reinforced through positive feedback from peers or group members, such as approval or status gained from committing a crime. In terms of social learning theory and the ideas of Albert Bandura, this is where role models, imitation, identification, and vicarious reinforcement come into play. For example, people may learn criminal behaviours by observing and imitating those around them, especially influential figures. And if they see someone else be rewarded for criminal behaviour, that will encourage them to do so too. Secondly, attitudes. Pro-criminal attitudes are where people justify or promote criminal behaviour. For example, believing that theft is acceptable if it benefits you. In contrast, anti-criminal attitudes discourage or condemn criminal behaviour. For example, believing that theft is morally wrong. Third, Sutherland introduced 4 key factors that influence how criminal behaviour is learned. Frequency. The more often a person interacts with others who engage in criminal behaviour, the more likely they are to adopt those behaviours. Duration. The longer the exposure to criminal influences, the greater the likelihood of learning criminal behaviour. Intensity. The emotional significance of these relationships also plays a role. Strong emotional bonds with pro-criminal individuals can lead to a higher likelihood of adopting criminal behaviours. Priority. The significance of the relationships in a person's life matters. Early interactions with, for example, family and close friends have a greater impact on shaping behaviour than later associations. Supporting evidence comes from Farrington et al. In 2006 with the Cambridge Study in Delinquent Development. This longitudinal study followed 411 working class boys from South London from age 8 into adulthood. Key findings included that 41% had at least one conviction by age 50, and strong predictors of offending included family background. Boys from disrupted families, where there were issues such as parental conflict or a history of criminality, were more likely to engage in delinquent behaviour. Peer influence. Association with delinquent peers was a significant predictor of offending, with boys who had friends involved in crime being more likely to engage in similar behaviours. School performance. Poor academic performance and low levels of school correlated with higher levels of delinquency. Boys who were disengaged with school were more likely to offend. A key strength of this theory is its wide applicability. It explains both blue-collar crimes like theft and vandalism and white-collar crimes like fraud because it depends on the individual's social group. However, there are a number of limitations. Number 1, overemphasis on nurture. This is because the theory puts the emphasis on how crime is learned through environmental factors, such as the friends and family you associate with and learn from. However, much research has pointed to how criminal behaviour is not just nurture, but nature and nurture interacting with one another. You may remember the study by Caspi et al. In 2002, who found that if a child had the low-activity MAOA gene, they are much more likely to develop antisocial behaviour problems if they also had experienced maltreatment. It's biology plus the environment. It's nature and nurture. Differential association theory can be criticised for being socially sensitive. This means that while psychological research can be used for human good, that same research can potentially be applied in ways that can cause harm. This is because it suggests that if you are brought up living in a certain city or town, perhaps where crime rates are higher, you are more likely to be a criminal yourself because these are the people you associate with. This could lead to the stereotyping of people who come from these types of backgrounds, and once people know your background, they could be more likely to deny you opportunities, like at a job interview. First up, cognitive distortions. These are biased ways of thinking that offenders use to justify their criminal behaviour. One cognitive distortion is called hostile attribution bias. This happens when an offender misinterprets social cues as hostile or threatening when they're not. Supporting evidence comes from Schoenberg and Just in 2014. The researchers showed participants a series of emotionally ambiguous faces. What they found was that the violent offenders were significantly more likely to interpret these ambiguous facial expressions as hostile or threatening compared to the control group. This suggests that misperceptions of social cues can contribute to violent behaviour. Another cognitive distortion is called minimalization. This is where offenders downplay the seriousness of their actions. Research conducted by Barbary in 1991 studied male sexual offenders and interviewed them to explore how they explained or justified their actions. Many offenders minimized the impact of their offences by downplaying the harm they'd caused to the victim. However, while cognitive distortions help us understand how offenders justify their behaviour, they don't really explain the root cause of offending. Are these distortions learned through their upbringing, or is there something biological at play? While minimalization can explain how offenders rationalize their crimes after the fact, it doesn't explain why the crime happened in the first place. In other words, cognitive distortions tell us how an offender thinks about their crime, but not what caused it. Lawrence Kohlberg was a psychologist who produced a theory of moral development. His theory has 3 levels, each divided into 2 stages, reflecting different reasons behind moral choices. For Kohlberg, criminal behaviour relates to a lower level of moral reasoning, in other words, level 1 and stages 1 and 2. In other words, their decisions are based on avoiding punishment or gaining something in return. Supporting evidence for the role of moral reasoning in crime comes from Ashkar and Kenny in 2007. The study focused on 2 groups of adolescents, one consisting of young offenders and the other of non-offenders. They presented them with moral dilemmas similar to those used by Kohlberg and analysed their responses. They found that the young offenders were found to reason at lower levels of moral development compared to the non-offenders, and this was particularly the case for offenders who committed violent crimes. However, Kohlberg's theory of levels of moral reasoning has been criticised in several ways. While Kohlberg's theory explains how offenders reason and think, it doesn't explain why they develop this type of reasoning in the first place. For that, we need to consider other explanations. Secondly, the way Kohlberg studied moral reasoning has been criticised. This is because he used moral dilemmas, which are hypothetical scenarios. Therefore, it can be argued that Kohlberg's theory of offending may be limited because it's based on research that lacks ecological validity. Finally, we can conclude our discussion on these cognitive explanations of offending by considering how these ideas can be used to deal with offending. Cognitive therapy helps offenders challenge and change their thinking. Enabling offenders to understand their thought processes is crucial for rehabilitation. If we can change how offenders think, helping them move beyond distorted thoughts and low-level moral reasoning, we may reduce the likelihood of reoffending. This is going to include an exploration of firstly the inadequate superego and then secondly Bowlby's maternal deprivation theory. Blackburn's theory of the inadequate superego is rooted in psychodynamic theory, particularly drawing on Freud's tripartite structure of the personality, the id, the ego, and the superego. Blackburn built on this idea to explain how criminal behaviour might result from an inadequately developed superego. Number 1, the weak superego. A weak superego arises when an individual's moral development is incomplete. This typically occurs due to poor parental relationships during childhood, where the child fails to internalize the moral standards of their parents. A deviant superego develops when the child internalizes a moral code that is at odds with societal norms. This can happen if a child is raised in an environment where their same-sex parent, their role model, is a criminal themselves. If they identify with these individuals, they will internalize their criminal moral values. The overharsh superego occurs when an individual's conscience is excessively critical. In such cases, the superego imposes unrealistic or overly rigid standards on the individual, causing overwhelming feelings of guilt and shame for minor transgressions. In other words, their conscience is so bothered that to relieve it, they want to be punished but need to commit a criminal act to receive punishment. Psychodynamic explanations of behaviour focus on the role of the unconscious mind, which is something that cannot be directly observed and is based on subjective interpretation. There is no way to falsify and disprove the theories. As a result, Blackburn's theory of the inadequate superego as an explanation of offending is questionable because it's hard to validate through experimental research. Another way his theory has been criticised is because of its overemphasis on childhood and parental influence. While earlier experiences are undoubtedly important, this explanation tends to downplay the role of other environmental factors that can influence criminality. For example, Sutherland proposed the differential association theory, which suggests that the people we hang around with, such as our peers, and the attitudes they have towards criminal behaviour can have a tremendous influence over criminal behaviour. The second psychodynamic theory of crime relates to Bowlby's maternal deprivation theory. Key to his theory is the critical period. Bowlby believed that a child needs a strong, continuous attachment to a caregiver during the first 2.5 years of life. However, if the child experiences prolonged separation from their caregiver during this critical period, it could lead to permanent psychological consequences. Affectionless psychopathy, a condition where individuals show a lack of empathy or concern for others, making them more prone to engage in criminal or antisocial behaviour. And delinquency. Bowlby's research suggested that prolonged separation from a caregiver could lead to increased risk of delinquency and criminal behaviour later in life. Evidence for Bowlby's maternal deprivation theory comes from his famous 44 Thieves study. He examined 44 juvenile delinquents who had a history of stealing and compared them to a control group of 44 non-delinquent children. Bowlby found that 14 of these children were diagnosed as affectionless psychopaths, characterized by a lack of guilt, empathy, or concern for others. Importantly, 12 of these 14 children had experienced prolonged separation during the critical period. This demonstrated the connection between maternal deprivation and criminal behaviour. However, there is evidence that challenges the findings from the 44 Thieves study and Bowlby's theory. Hilda Lewis in 1954 partially replicated Bowlby's study, but instead of 88 children, there were 500 young people. These children were admitted to the Mersham Reception Centre, which was basically a centre for what they called delinquent, maladjusted, homeless, or neglected children. What they found was that when they looked at the history of early prolonged separation for a child from their mother, what Bowlby called deprivation, it did not predict criminal behaviour. This is because they see the cause of criminal behaviour as something unconscious. This is referred to as psychic determinism, where unconscious forces are the driving cause behind behaviour. One of the problems with arguing that unconscious forces are the cause is that it can lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy, where they behave in line with what they understand happened to them as a child and go on to commit crimes because they believe that's just who they are now. Custodial sentencing refers to confining individuals in prison or similar institutions for a defined length of time as punishment for their crime. It's been suggested that custodial sentencing has 4 aims. Retribution is a punishment that makes the offender pay for the crime they committed. Rehabilitation aims to help offenders change so they're ready to rejoin society when they're released. Now let's talk about incapacitation. This is about protecting the public by physically preventing the offender from committing more crimes. Last, we have deterrence. Deterrence aims to discourage people from committing crimes by seeing the negative consequences of such behaviour. Recidivism refers to the tendency of previously convicted offenders to re-offend after they've been released from custody. In the UK, recidivism rates for individuals who've been in prison are notably high. Recent data shows that for those serving short sentences of less than 12 months, 63% of adults released from custody commit a proven reoffence within a year of their release. And there are several factors that affect recidivism, many of which relate to this next section. We've seen so far that custodial sentencing, or imprisonment, is one of the justice system's primary ways of punishing crime. But what can life inside prison do to a person psychologically? Let's start with institutionalization. Prisons are highly controlled environments where every detail of daily life, when to eat, when to sleep, is structured and supervised. Over time, this lack of autonomy can lead to feelings of helplessness and depression. Long-term prisoners often become so accustomed to prison structure that they struggle to manage with life outside of prison. Next, there's brutalization. This refers to how prison can make a person cruel, violent, or insensitive to the pain of others because of repeated exposure to violence. Number 3, psychological problems in prison populations. Life in prison also sees high rates of mental health issues. Depression and anxiety are common, often driven by fear for one's safety or the general lack of control inmates have over their environment. Another powerful factor is labeling. Being labeled a criminal or ex-prisoner can cause stigma that's hard to shake even after release. This can damage self-esteem, isolate individuals from support networks, and reduce their employability. Is there any research evidence for the negative effects of prisons? Well, you may remember a very famous study from the social influence topic called the Stanford Prison Experiment, led by psychologist Philip Zimbardo in 1971. The experiment simulated prison conditions so effectively that the participants randomly assigned as guards or prisoners quickly showed behaviours and responses that reflect the psychological impact observed in real prison settings. However, we should be cautious in using Zimbardo's study as evidence because it lacks ecological validity. Critics argue that the Stanford Prison Experiment lacked ecological validity due to the following factors. Firstly, artificial environment. Although the experiment aimed to simulate a prison, it was conducted in the basement of the psychology building at Stanford University and not an actual prison. Secondly, role-playing. Participants were aware they were taking part in a study, which may have led them to exaggerate their behaviours. Number 3, short duration. The experiment was ended after only 6 days, whereas real-life prison sentences can last years or even decades. A major criticism of research on the psychological effects of prisons is the problem of cause and effect. This is because it can be difficult to establish whether the negative psychological effects observed in prisoners, such as depression, anxiety, or institutionalization, are caused by imprisonment itself, or if they stem from pre-existing conditions. Behaviour modification is an intervention based on behaviourist psychology, so think B.F. Skinner and operant conditioning. It aims to change undesirable behaviours, such as criminal behaviour, by reinforcing positive actions and discouraging negative ones. A token economy is a structured reward system where prisoners earn tokens for good behaviour. These tokens can then be exchanged for tangible rewards like snacks, books, or phone calls. Primary reinforcers are naturally rewarding and satisfy basic human needs, such as food, water, or relief from discomfort. Secondary reinforcers have no inherent value, but gain significance through association with primary reinforcers. One of the most well-known studies on behaviour modification in prisons is Hobbs and Holt's 1976 research. They introduced a token economy system in a correctional facility for young male offenders aged 12 to 15. 125 boys in the prison were involved in the token economy system, and a separate control group did not receive this intervention. Over 14 weeks, the boys in the token economy system showed approximately a 33% increase in positive behaviours compared to the control group. While behaviour modification can improve prison behaviour, its long-term effectiveness is questionable. Good behaviour inside a structured prison system doesn't always translate to the real world, where there are no tokens or guaranteed rewards for following the law. Some critics argue that offenders learn to play the system just to earn rewards, but they don't actually change. Once the rewards disappear, so does their good behaviour. This means offenders may struggle to maintain positive behaviours after release. In other words, behaviour modification might not actually rehabilitate criminals, it might just delay reoffending. Another big issue with behaviour modification is ethics. Critics argue that it's manipulative, controlling behaviour through external rewards and punishments rather than helping offenders develop genuine motivation to change. Instead of making real choices, offenders are passive recipients of a system that controls them. This raises a huge question. Are we actually helping them change, or just making them more obedient for a short period? Anger management focuses on changing the way a criminal thinks. The idea is that if anger fuels their offending, then changing the way they think about anger can help change their behaviour. Cognitive preparation would involve understanding anger. Offenders need to be taught about the physiological, emotional, and psychological aspects of anger. Recognising triggers. Offenders are guided to identify specific stressors or triggers that provoke their anger. Identifying distorted thinking. Here, an offender needs to learn to identify their irrational thoughts, such as, "Everyone's out to get me," or, "If I don't stand up for myself aggressively, I'm weak." Offenders could be taught practical strategies, such as cognitive restructuring, replacing aggressive thoughts like "I need to fight back" with more rational ones like "I can stay in control without violence." Problem-solving skills. Learning to handle conflict constructively instead of reacting impulsively, such as by practicing assertive rather than aggressive responses to conflict. Relaxation techniques. Using deep breathing and mindfulness to calm themselves down in frustrating situations. This stage involves gradual exposure to triggers, facing real-life stressors in controlled environments, practicing staying calm under pressure. Feedback and refinement. Receiving guidance from therapists and peers to fine-tune their responses. One study that explored the effectiveness of anger management in offenders was conducted by Ireland in 2004. The study focused on 50 young male offenders who were divided into two groups: the intervention group, who participated in an anger management program, and the control group. To measure changes in anger and aggression, both groups completed two assessments: a self-report questionnaire where offenders rated their own anger levels, and an observational checklist completed by prison officers, which recorded incidents of angry or aggressive behaviour. So what did they find? Well, offenders who completed the anger management program showed significant reductions in self-reported anger and were involved in fewer aggressive incidents compared to those in the control group. Many participants maintained these improvements even after the program ended, suggesting that the strategies learned had lasting effects. Let's now compare anger management with the other way of dealing with offenders we covered in the last video, behaviour modification. Firstly, anger management can be praised for focusing on long-term emotional and behavioural change. This is because if the root cause of the offending is based on their anger issues, fixing this can lead to lasting change because they have changed, and giving offenders tools they can continue using after the program ends. In contrast, because behaviour modification relies on rewards and punishments, its effectiveness may be short-term. Once the external reinforcement stops, there's a risk that all behaviours will return. Therefore, anger management could be argued to be superior as a way of dealing with offenders because it can potentially lead to reducing recidivism in the long term, rather than the temporary change that comes from behaviour modification. Secondly, however, whilst anger management shows promise, its success heavily relies on the willingness of the offender. This is because if an individual is not motivated to change or address their issues, the techniques taught in the program may fall flat. On the other hand, behaviour modification works through external rewards and consequences, meaning an offender doesn't need to be personally motivated for it to have an effect. They follow the system because of the reinforcement, not necessarily because they want to change. Finally, a significant challenge to the use of anger management relates to resources. This is because delivering this type of intervention typically requires trained therapists who are skilled in cognitive therapy techniques. This reliance on specialized professionals not only increases the cost, but also requires a lot of time from the therapists and the offenders. Restorative justice is a method of reducing and atoning for offending behaviour through reconciliation between the offender and the victim, as well as the wider community. Restorative justice has three key aims. First, the rehabilitation of offenders, helping them understand the true impact of their actions and commit to meaningful change. Second, the atonement for wrongdoing, encouraging offenders to truly take responsibility, not just deal with legal consequences. And finally, considering the victim's perspective, giving them a voice in the process, a chance to express their feelings, and an opportunity to find closure. Sherman and Strang in 2007 conducted a meta-analysis into restorative justice. This means they conducted a review of existing research into restorative justice. They combined data from 36 studies that evaluated the effectiveness of restorative justice programs. These studies were carried out in a variety of countries, providing a broad international perspective on restorative justice practices. What did their research find about restorative justice? Three things. A reduction in recidivism. One of the central findings of the study was that restorative justice programs are generally effective in reducing reoffending, particularly for serious offenders. Victim satisfaction. The study found that victims involved in restorative justice processes reported higher levels of satisfaction than those who went through traditional criminal justice procedures. Offender accountability. Offenders were more likely to take responsibility for their actions and express remorse compared to offenders processed through the conventional criminal justice system. Restorative justice programs are often praised for their potential to create long-term changes in offenders and reduce recidivism rates. Directly involving offenders in face-to-face dialogue with victims can lead to stronger motivations for personal change and a commitment to not reoffend. Additionally, restorative justice offers support through counselling, education, or community involvement, which helps address the underlying causes of criminal behaviour. One of the main criticisms of restorative justice is that they are often done in different ways using various methods. This inconsistency can lead to different results and make the programs less effective. Some mediators may not have enough training, which can cause them to handle sensitive situations poorly, potentially harming the participants and lowering the program's trustworthiness. Because of this lack of standardization, it's hard to say for sure how effective restorative justice actually is. Another criticism relates to how widely it can be used. On the one hand, restorative justice can be and has been used for a range of different crimes. However, it may be less effective or appropriate with very serious crimes such as murder or sexual assault. This is because the victim may find confronting the offender a highly traumatic experience and could potentially make the situation worse. Additionally, it may not be suitable for all criminals. This is because there is always the risk of offender manipulation. Some criminals may agree to participate in a restorative justice session simply to receive a more lenient sentence without genuinely engaging in the process or taking responsibility for their actions. Furthermore, restorative justice programs can be criticised for requiring significant levels of motivation from both the victim and the offender, which can limit their effectiveness. For offenders, the process demands a willingness to take responsibility for their actions, acknowledge harm, and engage in meaningful dialogue with the victim, something that may be challenging for those who are not ready to face the consequences of their behaviour or who may not fully understand the impact of their actions. Similarly, victims must have the emotional readiness to confront their offender and participate in a process that could reopen emotional wounds. This can be particularly difficult for victims who may feel anger, fear, or distrust toward the offender. In both cases, the success of restorative justice hinges on the personal motivation of the individuals involved, and if either party is unwilling or unprepared to engage fully, the process may fail to achieve its intended outcomes of healing and accountability. And breathe. That's the whole of the forensics topic. For more resources to help you with A-level psychology so that you study smarter and save lots of time, check out the Bear It in Mind website.